JFK International Airport was buzzing with the usual chaos. Long lines at security, impatient travelers checking their phones, and airline staff working tirelessly to keep everything running smoothly. Among the sea of people was a tall, composed young man standing near the check-in counter. Barron Trump, the only son of President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump, had arrived for a flight to Florida. At 18, he had inherited his father's towering height and his mother's poise. Unlike his siblings, who thrived in the media spotlight, Barron preferred to keep a low profile. He was dressed simply, an expensive yet understated hoodie, designer jeans, and sneakers. He approached the counter with his passport and boarding pass in hand, ready to check in. A female airline staff member took his documents, her eyes immediately scanning his last name. "Trump?" she murmured, her lips curling slightly. A second staff member leaned in. "Wait, Barron Trump? As in the president's son?" The first woman hesitated, glancing between Barron and her colleague. "Are you sure these documents are real?" she asked, her tone sharp. Barron raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Before he could say another word, the situation began escalating in a way he never could have predicted. Barron Trump stood motionless as the two airline employees exchanged skeptical glances. He had traveled countless times before, but this was the first time he felt like he was being treated differently. "Sir, we need to verify your identity," the first staff member said, her tone laced with unnecessary authority. "Can you step aside for additional screening?" Barron frowned. "I've already provided my passport and boarding pass. What more do you need?" The second employee, a middle-aged man with a smug expression, folded his arms. "Well, anyone could fake an ID. And you're, he scoffed, lowering his voice. "A Trump." Barron's jaw tightened. He had dealt with subtle hostility before, people judging him for his last name, assuming things about his character just because of who his father was. But this was different. "I suggest you verify my details in your system," Barron replied calmly, trying to keep his patience. The woman snorted. "Sure, let's do that." She took his passport and walked over to another counter, whispering to a security officer. Barron watched as the officer's face twisted into a frown. The staff member nodded in his direction, and within seconds, 2 TSA agents approached him. "Sir, we need you to come with us," one of them said, motioning toward a private security room. Barron felt his stomach twist. This was getting out of hand. He sighed and shook his head. "You're making a mistake." The smug employee smirked. "We'll see about that." Little did they know, they were about to regret every decision they had just made. Barron Trump followed the 2 TSA agents into a small, sterile security room. A metal table stood in the center with 2 chairs on either side. The walls were bare except for a camera in the corner, its red light blinking ominously. "Have a seat," one of the agents instructed, his voice firm but not aggressive. Barron sat down, trying to keep his composure. He had never been in a situation like this before. His mother had always taught him to stay calm in public, no matter what, but he could feel irritation creeping in. The second agent placed his passport on the table and stared at him. "We have reason to believe you might be using a fake identity," he said. Barron exhaled sharply. "I don't see how that's possible when you have my official passport right in front of you." The first agent leaned forward. "Let's cut to the chase, Mr. Trump. The airline staff raised concerns that someone of your status wouldn't be flying alone like this. No security detail, no assistance. That seemed suspicious." Barron nearly laughed. "So I'm being questioned for not traveling with a security team? That's ridiculous." The second agent shrugged. "Just doing our job." "You're harassing me because of my last name," Barron said, his patience wearing thin. The first agent exchanged glances with his partner. "You need to stay here while we verify things." Barron's fists clenched under the table. They thought they had the upper hand. But what they didn't realize was that his mother was on her way, and there would be hell to pay when she arrived. At that very moment, inside the White House, First Lady Melania Trump was sipping her evening tea when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the caller ID Barron. A soft smile touched her lips as she answered, but the moment she heard his voice, the warmth faded. "Mom, I'm being detained at JFK," Barron said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. Melania's expression hardened. "What?" Her accent thickened slightly, a sure sign of her irritation. "By whom?" "TSA. They think my ID is fake. They won't let me board." Melania inhaled sharply, already feeling her protective instincts flare. "Give me names." Barron smirked despite the situation. He had always admired how his mother could go from elegant and composed to a force of nature in seconds. "Not sure yet, but they're acting like I'm a criminal." Melania's grip on her phone tightened. "Stay put. I am on my way." She didn't raise her voice, but there was a weight behind those words. She stood up, signaling to a nearby Secret Service agent. "We are going to JFK. Now." The agent, caught off guard, immediately relayed orders to the rest of the security team. Within minutes, a black motorcade was en route to the airport, and those who had mistreated Barron were about to realize they had made the biggest mistake of their careers. The streets of New York were no stranger to high-profile motorcades, but this one was different. Black SUVs with bulletproof windows zipped through traffic, sirens clearing the way. Inside the lead vehicle, First Lady Melania Trump sat poised, her eyes locked on the road ahead. Her phone was still in her hand, and her fingers tapped against it as she typed out a message. To her husband, President Donald Trump. "Melania, Barron is being detained at JFK. They think his ID is fake. Handling it now." A response came almost immediately. "President Trump." "What? Who did this?" Melania knew her husband's temper well, and she could already imagine the storm brewing inside the Oval Office. She chose her next words carefully. "Melania, I will take care of it. We'll update you soon." She put her phone away, her expression unreadable. Melania wasn't one for theatrics. She believed in actions, not words. And tonight, she was about to remind people exactly who she was. As the convoy approached JFK Airport, Secret Service agents were already in motion, securing a private entrance. The First Lady was minutes away from stepping into that terminal, where a few unfortunate airport employees were about to regret everything. Inside the TSA interrogation room, Barron Trump sat with his arms crossed, growing more impatient by the second. The two agents, still convinced they had caught an imposter, were whispering among themselves. "I don't know, man," the younger agent muttered. "What if this really is him?" The older one scoffed. "Yeah, and what? He thinks he can just pull the 'do you know who I am' card? We've got procedures." Barron shook his head. "You're going to regret this," he said, leaning back in his chair. The smug agent smirked. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Before Barron could respond, the door burst open. A Secret Service agent stepped in first, his face blank but his presence commanding. Behind him, the air itself seemed to shift. In walked First Lady Melania Trump. Her icy blue eyes scanned the room, her expression unreadable, her movements graceful yet precise. The room fell silent. The two TSA agents scrambled to their feet. "Mrs. Trump." She raised a single hand, silencing them instantly. "What?" she said, her accent sharp and deliberate. "Is the meaning of this?" The older agent swallowed hard. Ma'am, we were just conducting routine security measures." Melania stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor. "Routine?" she echoed. "You detain my son, humiliate him, question his identity, and you call this routine?" The agent visibly paled. "Ma'am, we didn't mean any disrespect." Melania's gaze locked onto him, and the weight of her cold fury was almost suffocating. "You didn't think," she corrected. Barron smirked. Now this was going to be fun. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The TSA agents, who moments ago had felt powerful detaining Barron Trump, now looked as if they wanted to disappear. Melania took another slow step forward, her elegant yet commanding presence filling the small interrogation room. "Tell me," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "what possible reason you had to detain the president's son?" The older agent fumbled for words. Mrs. Trump, we were just being cautious. High-profile names, your son, in this case, could be a security risk. We were verifying his identity. Melania's icy stare didn't waver. You think he is a risk? She gestured toward Barron, who raised an amused eyebrow. You, who work at an airport, cannot verify a simple passport? The younger agent tried to recover. We didn't mean to cause offense. We were just following protocol. Melania scoffed. Protocol? She tilted her head slightly, as if considering something. Tell me, agent, is it protocol to treat my son like a criminal? To deny him his rights? The agent's mouth opened, but no words came out. At that moment, another Secret Service agent stepped into the room and handed Melania a folder. Without breaking eye contact with the TSA officers, she opened it and scanned its contents. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she placed it on the table. The agents leaned in, and their faces turned ghostly pale. Inside the folder were official White House clearance documents, proving beyond a doubt that Barron Trump had every right to be there. Even more damning was a personal note from President Trump himself, authorizing his son's travel. Melania let the silence hang before speaking. You have made a very, very big mistake. The room remained eerily silent as the TSA agents processed what had just happened. Their faces were drained of color, their bravado completely shattered. The older agent cleared his throat, struggling to maintain composure. Mrs. Trump, we sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding. Melania held up a hand, cutting him off. Misunderstanding? She repeated, her voice now carrying a sharp edge. You detained my son, humiliated him, and treated him like some fraud. You call that a misunderstanding? The younger agent stammered. We were just doing our job. Melania's piercing gaze made him shrink back. No, she said. Your job is to ensure security, not to harass passengers based on their last name. Barron, still seated, crossed his arms and smirked. Told you you'd regret this. The lead TSA officer, now visibly sweating, tried to salvage the situation. We understand that this was a mistake. Please allow us to. Melania stepped even closer, her towering presence making them feel insignificant. You will allow my son to board his flight. Immediately, the agents nodded frantically, now desperate to fix their error. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Melania wasn't done. And you will personally escort him through security. You will ensure that no one else gives him trouble. Because if I hear one more word about him being detained. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to an almost menacing whisper. I will make sure you never work in this airport again. The agent swallowed hard, nodding furiously. Yes, ma'am. Melania straightened up, her work done. Good. She turned to Barron. Shall we? Barron grinned, standing up. Let's go, Mom. As they walked out, escorted by a now extremely nervous TSA team, every airport staff member who had doubted Barron watched in stunned silence. They had just messed with the wrong family, and they knew it. The terminal was eerily quiet as Barron and Melania Trump walked through, flanked by Secret Service and the now visibly shaken TSA agents. What had started as an arrogant display of authority by airport staff had completely backfired, and now they were reduced to nothing more than escorts, desperately hoping to avoid further consequences. Barron, towering over the group, couldn't help but smirk. Oh, how quickly the tables had turned. Melania walked with her signature elegance, not gloating, not rushing, just radiating power. Her presence alone was enough to make employees step aside, some even lowering their heads in quiet embarrassment. As they reached the VIP security checkpoint, the lead TSA officer turned to Melania, his voice shaking. Mrs. Trump, once again, we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. Melania didn't even acknowledge him. She turned to Barron. Do you have everything? Barron nodded, slipping his passport back into his pocket. Yeah, let's go. She placed a gentle hand on his arm and nodded toward the gate. Your flight is ready. One of the staff members gathered the courage to speak up. Would you like priority boarding, ma'am? We can arrange. Melania turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. You have done enough. The employee instantly shrank back. Barron took one last look at the people who had doubted, detained, and disrespected him. None of them could meet his gaze. He chuckled under his breath. Bet they won't forget this day anytime soon. Melania simply adjusted her coat. No, they won't. As Barron finally walked toward his gate, one thing was clear: the Trumps were not to be messed with. And for the TSA agents left standing there, drowning in their own regret, they knew one thing for certain. They had just made a career-ending mistake. As Barron Trump boarded his flight, the weight of the incident still lingered in the air. Passengers and airport staff watched in stunned silence, realizing that they had just witnessed something monumental. Back at the security checkpoint, the fallout had already begun. The lead TSA officer, still visibly shaken, reached for his radio. We need to file a report on this," he mumbled, his voice uncertain. But his younger colleague shook his head. "Are you kidding? We just detained the president's son under false suspicion. You think we're keeping our jobs after this?" The realization hit them like a freight train. Meanwhile, in Washington, the news of Barron's detention had reached President Donald Trump himself. Sitting in the Oval Office, Trump read through a security report handed to him by his chief of staff. His expression darkened with every sentence. He looked up at the Secret Service director who stood by his desk. "Find out the names of every single person involved in this," Trump said, his tone sharp. "I want them dealt with." The director gave a small nod. "Understood, Mr. President." Within hours, heads began to roll. Several TSA officers, including the two who had detained Barron, were suspended pending investigation. The airline staff who had mocked his last name were issued formal warnings. And at JFK Airport, an internal memo was sent out, reminding all employees that discriminating against passengers, especially those with high-profile status, was unacceptable. Back in Florida, as Barron stepped off his flight, he saw his mother waiting for him. The confrontation was over, but the lesson had been learned by everyone involved. Melania placed a hand on his shoulder. "You handled yourself well," she said. Barron smiled. "Guess I learned from the best." Melania gave him a knowing look. "Yes, and now, they have learned never to underestimate a Trump." With that, they walked away, leaving behind an airport full of people who would never forget the day they made the biggest mistake of their careers.